My wife told me I had no right to parent her son, so I stopped completely. Not out of spite, out of obedience. She asked me to stop being a parent. I listened. The problem is, her son didn't stop needing one. My wife Tara and I have been married for 3 years. Her son Mason is 11. His biological father Corey lives 2 states away and visits when the mood strikes him, which averages out to about 3 times a year. Always unannounced. Always with a gift too expensive for the occasion and too cheap for the absent. Mason calls me Owen. Not dad, not stepdad. Owen. I have never pushed the title because titles are earned and earning requires time, and time is the one thing a stepfather can offer without overstepping the boundary that someone else drew before he arrived. I drive Mason to school every morning because Tara leaves for work at 6:30 and the bus does not come until 7:45, and Mason does not like the bus because a kid named Wyatt calls him seatbelt for reasons Mason will not explain, and which I suspect involve the way Mason obsessively buckles and unbuckles his seatbelt as a self-soothing mechanism he does not know is a mechanism. I help with homework. I don't understand fractions, and my teacher explained it 3 times kind. I have explained fractions using pizza, Legos, a measuring cup, and once a Kit Kat bar. I broke into uneven pieces on purpose so he could see that 4/8 and 1/2 are the same amount of chocolate, and the injustice of unequal portions is actually a math lesson. I attend every basketball game. I sit in the 3rd row because the first 2 rows are for parents, and I have been told by Tara, gently but specifically, that the first 2 rows are for parents, and the phrasing includes a boundary I am expected to observe from the 3rd row where the aunts and family friends sit. I coach from the 3rd row in whispers Mason cannot hear, but which I produce anyway, because coaching is a reflex that does not require an audience. I pack his lunch when Tara forgets, which is more often than she knows because I do not tell her I am doing it. Turkey and cheese, no mustard, apple slices in a separate bag, a note that says something small. Crush it today. 4/8 equals 1/2, and don't let anyone tell you otherwise. I do not sign the notes, because signing them would mean putting a name on something I am not sure I am authorized to put a name on. The fight happened 3 weeks ago. Mason's basketball coach Banks called me, not Tara, me, because I am the number Mason gave him as his emergency contact. Mason had gotten into a shoving match during practice. Another kid had been mocking him for weeks. Mason pushed first. Coach benched him. I drove to the school. I sat with the coach. I talked to Mason in the car. I said, I understand why you pushed him, but pushing gets you benched, and benched means you're not playing, and not playing means he wins. You're smarter than the push. Use the smarts. He said, thanks, Owen. That night, I told Tara about the call and the conversation. She stopped stirring. She said, the coach called you? I said, Mason listed me as emergency contact. She said, you went to the school. You talked to his coach. You had a conversation with my son about his behavior without calling me. I said, you were at work. I handled it. She said, you don't get to handle it. He is my son. You are not his father. You are my husband. Those are 2 different things. You do not get to walk into a school and have a parenting conversation about a child you did not create. She said, create like biology was a credential and love was an internship. I said, the coach called me. I responded. I didn't overstep. I showed up. She said, showing up is the overstep. You don't have the right to parent Mason. You have the right to be in this house and be kind to him. That's the line. I stood there hearing the woman I married tell me that the child I have been driving to school and packing lunches for and explaining fractions to and coaching from the 3rd row for 3 years is not mine to parent. That 3 years of showing up is showing up to the wrong line. I said, okay. She said, okay, what? I said, I'll stop parenting. You said I don't have the right. I'm respecting that. Effective immediately, I am not a parent. I am your husband who is kind to your son. That's the line. I'll stay behind it. She said, that's not what I said, that's exactly what you said. I'm listening. I stopped. The next morning, I did not drive Mason to school. Tara was already at work. Mason came downstairs with his backpack at 7:10. He stood at the door. He said, Owen, are we going? I said, your mom is handling school transportation now. The bus comes at 7:45. He said, I don't like the bus. I said, I know. He waited by the door for 35 minutes. I could see him from the table. He sat on the front step with his backpack between his knees, buckling and unbuckling the chest strap, that little click, click, click rhythm that means his brain is working on something it cannot solve. He came home and mentioned that Wyatt had called him seatbelt 4 times on the ride. I did not pack his lunch. Tara forgot. Mason ate the school cafeteria lunch, which he described as meat that tasted like the color gray. I did not help with homework. He asked me about fractions. I could see exactly where he was stuck. I could have explained it in 30 seconds using the Kit Kat method, which was his favorite because it involved chocolate and fairness, and both made sense to his brain. Instead, I said, ask your mom when she gets home. He said, she doesn't know fractions. I said, then ask your teacher tomorrow. He sat at the table staring at the worksheet for 40 minutes and put it in his backpack unfinished. I did not go to the basketball game on Thursday. At halftime, Tara texted, Mason keeps looking at the 3rd row. Where are you? I said, I'm at home. You told me the first 2 rows are for parents. I'm not a parent. I don't know which row I belong in anymore. The notes stopped. The emergency contact was changed. The coach called Tara the following week about a schedule change. She did not answer. She did not check the voicemail until the next day. Mason missed practice. He was the only kid who did not show up. He sat in the cafeteria for an hour, waiting for a ride that was not coming, because the person who always came was sitting at home, respecting a boundary he was told not to cross. 14 days. 14 days of Mason riding a bus where Wyatt calls him seatbelt every morning. 14 days of gray cafeteria meat and homework sitting unhelped. 14 days of an empty 3rd row and a boy looking for someone who was not there because someone told the someone that showing up was the overstep. 14 days of a guest room bed because sleeping in the same bed as a woman who reduced 3 years of fatherhood to being kind felt like sleeping in a bed I was told I was only allowed to occupy, not live in. The gaps I left behind were not getting filled. They were sitting there, open, like holes in a floor everyone stepped around but nobody patched. And Mason was the one walking closest to the edges. Last Tuesday, around 8:30, I heard a knock on the guest room door. Not Tara's knock. A single knock followed by silence. Like the person on the other side was not sure he was allowed to be there. Mason was in his pajamas, the ones with faded basketballs that were getting too short in the ankles because he had grown an inch since September, and nobody had taken him shopping because shopping stopping felt like a parenting activity, and I was not sure whose job that was anymore. He sat on the edge of the bed, not in the middle, the edge, like he was ready to leave if I told him this was across the line too. He said, "Owen, why did you stop?" I said, "Your mom asked me to." He said, "She asked you to stop being my dad?" The word dad came out of his mouth like it had always been there, sitting behind his teeth, waiting for a reason to come out. And the reason turned out to be a question on the edge of a guest room bed at 8:30 on a Tuesday. I said, "She asked me to stop parenting you." He said, "That's the same thing." I said, "I know." He said, "Wyatt called me seatbelt again today." I said, "I'm sorry." He said, "I wanted to tell you in the car, but there's no car anymore." He was not talking about the car. He was talking about the 7 minutes between our driveway and the school where he used to tell me things. About Wyatt, about practice, about the girl who sits behind him, who smells like strawberries and makes him nervous. 7 minutes of a boy talking to the person he trusted in the only space that felt safe enough to talk in. And I took that space away because I was told it was not mine to occupy. He reached into his backpack. He pulled out a piece of paper, folded, a school emergency contact update form, my name, my number, and on the relationship line, where the form says parent/guardian/other, Mason had crossed out all 3 options and written a 4th word in his 11-year-old handwriting. Owen. Not parent, not guardian, not other. Owen. A category he created because the categories on the form did not include what I am. There is no box for the person who drives you to school and explains fractions with candy bars and packs your lunch without signing the notes and sits in the 3rd row and whispers coaching advice you cannot hear, but he says it anyway because he cannot help it. There is no box for the person who shows up. So Mason made one. He said, "Can you come back, please?" I said, "I need to talk to your mom first." He said, "I already talked to her." I said, "What did she say?" He said, "She cried." Tara came to the guest room that night. She sat where Mason had sat, the same edge. Like the bed had a mark on it now for people who came to this room to say things that mattered. She said, "I was wrong." I said, "About what specifically?" She closed her eyes for a beat too long. Then she said, "About the line. I put the line where Corey should have been standing and you were standing there instead, and it scared me. Because if you're his parent and you leave the way Corey left, then Mason loses 2 fathers instead of 1. I was protecting him from a loss I hadn't processed by removing the person who was preventing it. It was never about me going to the school. It was never about the coach calling my number. It was about Corey. Corey, who shows up 3 times a year with gifts that cost more than his phone calls and less than his presence." Tara watched one man walk away from her son and decided the solution was to make sure no other man could get close enough for the walking away to matter. Husband, not father. Kind, not parental. Close enough to help, but never close enough to hurt when I disappeared. Except I did not disappear. I showed up every single day, and my consistency was a mirror that reflected Corey's absence, and she could not look at it anymore. She said, "You showed up every day and I punished you for it because showing up is the thing Corey never did, and I didn't know how to trust it." I said, "Do you trust it now?" She said, "Mason wrote your name on a school form in a box that doesn't exist. He invented a category. If that's not trust, I don't know what is." I drove Mason to school the next morning. He buckled his seatbelt, unbuckled it, buckled it again. That little plastic snap I had been hearing for 3 years. He said, "Owen?" I said, "Yeah?" He said, "Wyatt called me seatbelt again yesterday." I said, "What did you do?" He sat up straighter like he had been waiting for me to ask. Like this was the part of the story he had been carrying, and he finally had the right person to hand it to in the right seat in the right car. He said, "I told him my stepdad said I'm smarter than the push, so I didn't push. I just said, 'That's my name. What's yours?'" He called me his stepdad, not to me, to Wyatt. On a bus, I was not driving. Using words I said in this car 3 weeks ago during the conversation, Tara called an overstep. He used the word stepdad the way you use a shield, and the shield was words I gave him on the day the coach called, the day I drove to the school and sat with Banks and got in this car and gave him the only advice I had, and he kept it. He held on to it through 14 days of gray meat and an empty 3rd row and a guest room door and a bus where a kid called him names every morning. I said, "He stopped?" He said, "The smarts worked?" He looked at me and there was something on his face I had never seen before. Something that looked like a boy who had tested a thing he believed in and found out it held. He said, "The smarts always work. That's why you taught me." I was never overstepping. I was building something, and the thing I built held up even when I was pulled away from it because the thing was not mine anymore. It was his. The title was not given in a room or on a form. It was given on a school bus to a bully in a moment of courage, using borrowed words from a man who had been told he had no right to lend them. I did not stop being a parent. I stopped performing it, and the performance was the only part that was mine to stop. The rest belonged to Mason. It always did. The 3rd row has my name on a folded piece of paper in a category that does not exist on any form. And the boy in the passenger seat just called me his stepdad for the first time to defend himself with a sentence I gave him 3 weeks ago when I still had the right to give it.